Hello, I'm Corrie. Welcome to Stories with Corrie. Okay, so before we begin, ask yourself this. Have you ever felt like God doesn't see you? And not just like the bad things you do, but just like maybe the sad things. And you're like, you know what? God doesn't see, God doesn't care. God doesn't hear me when I pray. God, where is God in this chaos? Where is God in my story that is so broken that it just seems like everything is against me and everything is falling apart and I don't understand, and apparently God doesn't care and can't use this. But I'm here to tell you and to show you through the story of Hagar today that that is not true. That He is truly a God that hears, and He's a God that sees, He is a God that answers, and He is a God that provides, and He is a God that can use even the most tragic of stories to bring about good and to use, to redeem your story. Okay, so to illustrate this, we're going to tell the story of Hagar, and it comes from the book of Genesis. So if you've been tracking, you know that Genesis tells a lot about the story of Abram, and in fact, he does play quite a role in the story, but we're going to focus on Hagar today because we need more girl stories. Okay, so once upon a time in a faraway land of Egypt, there was a young girl named Hagar, and she was a slave in Pharaoh's court, apparently. And while she was down there living her slave life, some foreigners arrived. Now there was a famine in the north, like in the land of Canaan, there was a severe famine, and Abram had taken his whole family and all of his belongings, and they went south because they heard that Egypt had plenty of toilet paper, and they're like, this is where it's at, and they've got Costco's too, so we're good. So they came down to escape the famine, and on their way, Abram told his wife Sarai, don't tell anyone you're my wife because you're so hot. Like, I don't want anyone to kill me and take you as their wife because that's probably what's going to happen. So let's just tell them that you're my sister. So that's what they agreed on the way down. Terrible idea. And they got there and they were like, hi, who are you? And Abram was like, hey, I'm Abram. This is my sister, Sarai. And they all said, my sister. Sure enough, all the princes of Pharaoh's house were like, dang, that girl, she's got it going on. Little did they know that she was like 75, but that's neither here nor there. So word got around about this fair maiden that had arrived from the north, and Pharaoh himself was so smitten with this woman's beauty that he paid Abraham so that he could have her as his wife, and Abraham just went along with it. Like, crazy guy. You know what? I would have words to say if that was my husband, but that's another story for another day. So Pharaoh paid Abram in like livestock and in slaves, including Hagar, and took Sarah to be his wife. But before he could do so, this whole house was like plagued with plagues, and everyone was getting sick, and everyone was freaking out, and they were all in quarantine, and the whole economy shut down. It was like crazy, and then the Pharaoh started to think to himself, he's like, what's this? How did? She's not his sister. He's his wife. They went to Abraham and said, you liar. You like lied to me. She is your wife. Get out of here. So he sent Abram with his wife Sarah packing back to the north with all of the things that they'd acquired. He let him keep the dowry, including the slave Hagar. So they went north and they lived their life, and you know some of the story here, there, and everywhere about Abram and his encounters with God and fighting for Lot's life and all the things. Well, there was Hagar as the handmaiden of Sarai. Well, one day Sarai had an idea. These guys had some ideas, let me tell you. And she had an idea, and she came to Abram and she said, you know, I know like God promised that you were going to have a son, but I don't know if you've noticed. I mean, apparently no one in Egypt noticed, but I'm getting kind of old. Like, too old to be having children. I'm sure God had like a plan, but I think like I have a better plan. So why don't we just like let Hagar be the mother of your child? Not genius. So Abraham went along with this plan, and he took Hagar, and guess what? Hagar was about to have a child by Abraham. Well, as soon as Sarai saw that this plan was, working, she freaked out. She's like, what? Because now Hagar kind of had a haughty heart about it. And she's like, my mistress wanted to have a kid, and she couldn't, but look at me. I can have a kid, and you can't. Which back then was kind of a big deal. So anyways, Hagar got a little haughty. Sarah got super jealous. And if you know anything about girls, I'm using my glasses a lot today. Don't make them jealous. Well, Sarah started to abuse her slave. It's pretty tragic, actually. So much so that Hagar just gave up and she ran away and she ran into the wilderness and she laid down by a brook and she was about to die and she just thought, what life is this? I was first a slave and then another slave and now I'm bearing this child for my master and my mistress is abusing me and I'm just, and then it says the angel of the Lord showed up and he said, Hagar, where did you come from? Where did you go? Where did you come from? Got no idea. And he said, where are you going? And she said, I'm running away from my mistress because she's the worst. And the angel of the Lord said, Hagar, go back, submit, you're going to bear a child, and you're going to name him Ishmael. And, we English speakers are like, neat name. It's cool. But the name Ishmael means that God hears. So she's listening to God, the angel of God, God in the flesh, talking to her, saying, name your son Ishmael, like God hears, because he's listening. And then there she lay by this brook, and she calls this place, I don't know, this really long name, and I can't pronounce it, but she calls it this name because of the attribute of God that is revealed. And it's El Roy, which means that God sees. And not just like sees, like, not just like us walking along the street and seeing homeless people and thinking, oh, that's really sad, and then walking away. This is the God who sees the blind man on the side of the road and gives them sight. This is the God that sees someone who is deaf and gives them their hearing. This is the God who sees a broken heart in the wilderness and comes down to meet her and says, I hear and I see. And I'm going to make you a promise that your son will live and he will have 12 sons of his own, and they are going to be a great and multitudinous nation. They're not going to get along with anyone, and no one's going to get along with them, but they will be a great nation if you just trust and believe. And they're going to play a role in this promise that I made to Abraham. They're going to play a role in the story that I've been writing since the beginning of creation. They are going to play a role. And Hagar, if you but trust, and if you just go back and submit, I promise. I've seen and I've heard, and now I'm about to answer. So Hagar goes back to her mistress, and she submits, and she bears a son. And sure enough, Abram names his son Ishmael, which means God hears. And Ishmael grows up until about 14, and then Isaac is born, his half-brother, Sarah's actual son. And things go south again, and it gets really intense and really fierce, and the jealousies are just so tumultuous, and emotions are running high, and Hagar gets kicked out. Sarah is finally like, you know what? My son is going to be the heir of Abram, and you need to leave. So Abram sends her off into the wilderness with a loaf of bread and a bag of water and says, I'm really sorry, but good luck. She goes off into the wilderness, and they've drunk all their water and they've eaten all their bread, and so she lays her son, who's like 14, under the bush, and she's like, stay here, I'm gonna go over there and die, I don't want to watch you die. And so she wanders across the wilderness, and guess what? God speaks again, and he says, Hagar, I promised you, I told you you were going to have a son. I told you your son's going to be a multitudinous, it's not even a real word, but your son is going to be a multitude, a real nation with many chiefs and many princes, and they're going to be great. Just trust me. And sure enough, she looks up, and there's a well. She'd never seen this well before, and there it was, in the middle of the wilderness. And she was reminded of that time again, and he said, when God had showed up there that second time in the wilderness, he said, I heard your son's cry. Kind of hearkening back to the other moment where he said, I heard your cry in the wilderness. Your son is named Ishmael. I have heard your cry, and I'm going to provide, and here's a well. So time and time again in the story of Hagar, and sure enough, they survived. They got the water, they survived. Ishmael grew up. He got a wife, an Egyptian wife, and they had 12 sons. And they grew up to be a great and mighty nations all throughout the south and the wilderness, the Arab nations, many of whom may or may not have descended from them today. So before you think that God is a God who just created the world and sits back and watches with a big bowl of popcorn, Know that he is a God that hears, and he is a God that sees, and he is a God that provides. He is a God that intervenes on our behalf. He's a God who doesn't just see and say, well, that's too bad. Wish I could help. He is a God who sees, like a shepherd. I think that word, I don't know Hebrew super well, but I see a lot of times that word is intimately connected to this word that is tied to shepherding. Like a shepherd that sees that their sheep are hot, so he finds them a cool pasture or some cool water, or sees that his sheep are hungry and doesn't say, oh, that's too bad. But he feeds them, and it sees that they're shaggy and says, oh, I wish you guys could shear yourself. He cheers them. So that's where it's connected to. A God that sees, and a God that hears, and a God that will provide because he's paid attention. So before you think that your story is beyond redemption, or that God doesn't care, that God isn't involved, learn from the past. See these characters and see the character of God in the way that he intervenes in these people's lives. Okay, so that's the story of Hagar. If you want to read more, it's all throughout the book of Genesis. I'll put the actual references in the notes below. But if you have any comments or concerns, yep, just hit me up with them. So until next time, this is Stories with Corrie.